Well, good morning, St. John's. How good and how pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity. So that is Psalm 133:1, and that is also not only my text for today, but the text around the nation, as many different churches and ministries throughout the U.S. are preaching from this same text. And we're preaching about the unity that brings us all together in Christ Jesus, no matter our race, our ethnicity, our form of religion. But we're speaking a word of reconciliation today, a word of unity. So it is good and pleasant to dwell together in the Lord. And we're going to talk a lot about grace today. But first, it's time for another freshman year at Marymount story. All right, so picture it. It's 1990-something. I'll just say something. And Blockbuster Video was our highest form of entertainment. We freshman girls at Marymount still put quarters in our penny loafers in case we had to go make a phone call at a public payphone. And the internet was just a glimmer in someone's eye. Yep, that was the 90s. And that year at Marymount, bagels were $1. Now, bagels were all the rage at Marymount, and I don't know how much you know about some of LA's private schools, but there's generally 3 different classes of students there. There are the ultra-rich girls, the girls who show up with their nannies or their chauffeurs driven in their Bentleys or their Rolls Royces, like the Kardashians, who went there years after I did. Then there are the semi-rich girls, the girls who never have to think about money, but who are quiet and less ostentatious. Finally, there are the regular girls, the girls from hardworking, sacrificing families, the girls who are scholarship girls. And in these 3 classes, we had one united love: the love of our morning bagels. So in the snack bar, they sold them in many different ways, and the rich girls liked their bagels perfectly toasted with just a thin smidge of cream cheese lightly swept on their bagel. Okay, but then there were the scholarship girls, the countercultural girls, and we liked our bagels raw. Yes, we did. We broke them into little hunks and we dipped them in the cream cheese, and that's how we did it. Well, most of the girls, $1 for a bagel, no big deal. But for some of us, back in the 90s, $1 was something that we had to think about a little bit. And so for some of us girls, we had a system of borrowing and lending so that we could have our morning bagels. Well, one day in May, Sachi, a beautiful Japanese girl who played first chair violin, came up to me and said, "May I please borrow $1?" And I said, "Of course, Sachi, you may borrow $1. Just pay me back, okay?" So she said, okay. I had my bagel. She had her bagel. Life went on. A week later, no $1. 2 weeks later, no $1. It's getting towards the end of the school year. Yearbooks are being passed out. Senior predictions are being read. Still no $1. So I said, "Sachi, just pay me back on the last day of school." She said, okay. What do you think happened? No $1. So I went away from Marymount that year, not being paid back, having been ripped off by Sachi. Well, I didn't return to Marymount the next year. I transferred to a different private school. So my takeaways from Marymount for the longest time were that most teen girls never appreciate an all-girls education until they're adults, and Sachi still owed me $1. Well, this debt that remained uncanceled, I took with me through high school, through college, flash forward to the second year of Fuller, and I'm still thinking about this. So I hung out with many of the international students at Fuller, and I had some friends from Ethiopia who worked in the library. One day I'm checking out a book, and my friend is telling me about the communal nature of Christianity in Ethiopia. And somehow we get talking about borrowing and lending. And I said, well, I'm such a shrewd businesswoman. Nobody has ever owed me money, except Sachi. She still owes me $1. So he looks at me and asks for the whole story, and I tell him the whole story. And I think he's going to be impressed with my, business skills and my hard-nosed cutthroatedness. But he looks at me and he says, well, what about a year of Jubilee? So I stop and I think, because I know what the biblical year of Jubilee is. It's every 7 times 7 years, right? Every 49 years, on the Day of Atonement, they will blow a ram's horn and slaves get freed and property gets returned to its original owners and the land gets to lie fallow. So for that Jubilee year, everything is pointing towards grace. So I understood what he was telling me. He was suggesting that maybe I could cancel this debt. Maybe I could forget about it. Maybe I could give Sachi a little grace. And he reminded me that I've been forgiven for bigger things than $1. So it was time to let you go. It was time to let Sachi go. And if I see Sachi again, the debt is canceled. I'm sure she's paid it forward a number of times. But even if she hasn't, she gets her Jubilee. Well, today we're going to talk about grace, because in the Bible there are so many stories about grace and how God pours grace on us, how we see the grace of Jesus consistently through the New Testament. So I'm going to share with you some stories that you know, stories that you've heard, and we're just going to shed a little bit of extra light on them as we think about God's grace. The first story is about the woman at the well. And you all know this story. This is the story that begins, and Jesus had to go through Samaria. We'll talk about that in a minute, but I'm going to read you a few verses here. So right now we are in John chapter 4, and we are reading about Jesus' travels. So he came to Jacob's well, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well, and it was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus asked her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Okay, so let's talk about this a little bit. So Samaritans were the outsider worshipers, right? They were the people who believed that God should be worshiped at their hill, at their mountain, and not in the temple of Jerusalem. And they had since 200 BC, well, they had maybe had wonderful music, but they had also had, since 200 BC, a feud with the Jewish people. So Jews and Samaritans did not get along at all. And the historian Josephus said that the quickest way from Judea to Galilee was through Samaria. But Jesus really didn't have to go through Samaria because most Jews walked all the way around it. So it wasn't really a geographical thing that made him have to go, need to go through Samaria. It was a matter of the heart. It was a theological reason, because there was somebody he wanted to talk to at that well, and there was something that he wanted to do there. So why is this woman in the middle of the day alone at a well getting water so that Jesus can walk up and start a conversation? In most cultures where women still draw water from wells, they go together. They go together for safety reasons. They go together for social reasons. They go together because that's the convention. But this woman had none of that. She didn't have the social support network of the women in the village. She didn't have that safety. She didn't have anything. She was just there alone in the middle of the day. Well, in the story, as you know, Jesus talks back and forth with her. In fact, it's one of the longest dialogues in the Gospels. Jesus talking to this woman at the well. So they talk back and forth, and Jesus says, well, why don't you bring your husband? This is where it gets a little interesting because she says she doesn't have a husband. And Jesus says, you're right. You've had 5 husbands, and the person you're with now isn't even your husband. Well, at this point, it gets more interesting because then she says, sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Okay, so a lot of people think that she's trying to, at this point, shift the narrative, shift the story away from her and her embarrassment and what she's going through. Maybe, or maybe not. Maybe she does think that he's a prophet because her next question is, where should we worship? Maybe this is a genuine question, her wanting to engage with a prophet of God to find out the correct answer to this big problem between the Jews and the Samaritans of where to worship. So maybe it's not her trying to distract from her life at all, but trying to dig deeper and get closer to God. So when Jesus says, call your husband, a lot of people think that maybe this woman has been an evil temptress, right? How could she go through so many men? But there's some other explanations as well. Maybe she's been widowed that many times. That could happen back in those days when people died at the average age of 40. Maybe she was divorced that many times because in those days, a husband could divorce a wife, but a wife couldn't divorce a husband. So maybe her husband found something about her that they didn't like and kept divorcing her. So let's not quite jump to conclusions because what we know about the story is that Jesus engages with her and Jesus talks with her. In fact, when she says, out of her wanting to know more, when she says, when the Messiah comes, I know he will tell us all things, that he's going to clear up all the confusion. This is where it gets supremely interesting because Jesus said, I who am speaking with you am he. Mic drop, everybody, because Jesus is revealing himself to an outcast woman at a well who's a Samaritan. He's not telling this to the learned rabbis. He's not telling this to a group of kings. He's telling this to a lone woman outcast. And what does she do? She drops everything. She doesn't even take her water with her. And she goes back to her community and she tells everyone, come see a man who tells everything I ever did. Is this not the Christ? She goes straight to those people who were her tormentors, who had made her an outcast, and she brings them to Jesus. And because of her words, many people are saved. Well, you see what Jesus did there? He didn't just answer her questions. He didn't just heal her heart, but he reconciled her with her community. He enfolded her in her community again. And in that, we see the grace of Jesus, that he loops her back into community so that no longer is she standing in the middle of nowhere at a well alone, but she's enfolded with her community as they're all sitting and standing before Jesus. So let's think about ways in which we can loop back into community. Ways in which we might be able to extend some Jubilee to people, ways in which we might be able to bind people together. So the Bible says God puts the lonely in families. And here at St. John's, it's kind of like a family. It is a family. And so when we're thinking about the grace of God, we can also think about how we can extend that to one another here at St. John's and in the bigger Christian community as well. Because that's what we're doing today for this National Day of Unity, where we're all preaching our individual sermons about this same verse. So I want to take us to another incident of grace and restoration in the Bible. And this is a more somber story. This is the story where Peter denies Jesus 3 times. And for this one, we are in the book of Luke, chapter 22, starting around verse 54. Then seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance. And when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat with them. A servant girl saw him there in the firelight. She looked closely and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him." A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." And just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. This is a story that we all can identify with. And I know that we all have things that we're probably thinking about even right now. Think about, but don't tell any of us, one of your worst deeds, one of your biggest mistakes. And think about how it made you feel at the time, but also think about how it felt when you knew that Jesus had forgiven you. Because that's what happens in this story with Peter. After Jesus is risen again, he has a conversation with Peter in which he asks Peter 3 times if he really loves him. And this time, Peter isn't bragging about how constant he is and how brave and faithful he is. But each time, he tells the Lord that he loves him. But the 3rd time, he says, "Lord, you know all things. You know I love you." He just opens his heart up to God. He doesn't try to pretend that he's perfect or better than he is. And then Jesus says, "Feed my sheep." He wants Peter to go back and encourage his brothers, encourage the women, encourage the church based on his reconciliation with Jesus. So Jesus loops Peter back into community, loops Peter back into being the leader that he is. And in fact, Peter goes on to be the leader of the church, the first pope, and more importantly, the confession of Peter that Jesus is the Christ is what we've all built our churches upon. So Jesus, once again, is enfolding someone back into the community, and we see that grace. Okay, one more story, and you know this one as well. And this is the story of the woman with the issue of blood. And I'll give some historical context for this story. So in Jewish culture, women getting their periods were considered ritually unclean, so that if a man touched a woman getting her period, she would have made him ritually unclean, and he couldn't worship with the community until he had purified himself. Well, this woman had been bleeding for 12 years. So not only was she an outcast with the men, but she was also an outcast with women, because Jewish women have a ceremony of purification after that time of the month, and they go to what's called a mikveh. And a mikveh, in its basic, most easily understood term, is like a pool of water that you go to dip yourself into to be ritually purified. Well, the thing about mikvahs is they are so important that whenever a new Jewish community is founded somewhere geographically, they will build the mikvah first, even before they build a synagogue. And that's not only for the purification part of things, but it's also because women are central in Jewish religion in deep ways that are sometimes misinterpreted. So this woman had been out of community with the other women for 12 years. Because at mikvahs, especially Orthodox mikvahs even now, it's not just a little pool where you dip yourself, but it's a whole experience where there are beauty treatments that you can get, there are spa-like services. So, and who doesn't love a good spa day with their gal pals, their girlfriends, right? So she had been out of community with men and women for 12 years. And while Jesus is on his way to heal Jairus' daughter, who incidentally is 12 years old as this woman has had this issue of blood. While Jesus is on his way to heal Jairus' daughter, this woman with the issue of blood, she determines in and of herself that if she can touch the hem of his garment, what is also known as the wings of the garment, the tassels that Jewish men wear, their prayer tassels, and that part of the garment, if she could just touch the hem of that, not make him ritually unclean, just touch the hem, that she would be healed. She had that faith. And when she touched the hem of his garment, Jesus stopped. He noticed. And he said, "Who touched me?" And Peter said, "Well, everybody's crowding around you. What do you mean, who touched me? It could have been anybody who touched you." But Jesus said, "No, I felt power go out of me. Who touched me?" And the woman realized that she couldn't remain hidden. So she came forward and she explained, it was me. She had had that issue of blood. And Jesus said, "Go, your faith has made you whole." So again, an act of shalom, an act of enfolding her back into her community. That's what all of these stories have in common, that Jesus is always bringing people not just to himself, but into community. And as we're thinking about Psalm 133:1, how good and pleasant it is for us to live together in unity, no matter our color or our form of religion or anything else. It's this act of shalom that God is doing even now today to enfold us together and to help us walk together with each other. And that is part of the amazing grace of Jesus. So one thing I want to ask you today, give you a challenge. Where can you find in your life someone who needs your year of Jubilee? Someone who needs shalom, someone who needs to be enfolded into the community? Or is it you today who need to be reconciled and enfolded back into the community? Is it you today who have something that you want to ask Jesus to forgive? Whatever it is, I want you to think about today that reconciliation that God provides for each of us. That not only did Jesus die for us on the cross, but he also brings us together. So in the catechism that many of us don't memorize anymore, but what is the chief end of man? The chief end of man is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. And that doesn't just mean we're enjoying God in solitude. It means that we're enjoying God in community. So what we do with our summer nights, what we do with our potlucks and hanging out under the tree, that's all a part of this new community, this new thing that God is building. And it goes back to redemption. It goes back to Jubilee. So my challenge for you, my charge for you today is to seek out someone or something that needs that redemption, that needs that enfolding into community, and to reach out and take that one next step. Sachi no longer owes me $1. Who can you forgive today? Who will no longer owe you? St. John's.
Now for a time of silent meditation. Thank you, Marie, for those words that are so freeing and so much needed in our hearts and our minds and world. Let us pray to the Lord in our hearts for the next minute or so.